What if I told you that one of the most famous stories in American history never actually happened? Or that another fact millions of people believe today is completely backwards? History has a funny way of turning stories into legends, and legends into facts. After enough time, it becomes almost impossible to tell the difference. So today, we're going to try to separate fact from fiction. These are some of the biggest myths in American history, and by the end of this video, you might realize that some of what you've believed for years isn't quite as true as you thought. Our first myth takes us back to colonial Massachusetts in 1692. If you've ever watched a movie, read a novel, or heard somebody talk about the Salem Witch Trials, you've probably imagined people being tied to wooden stakes and burned alive. It's one of the most enduring images in American history. The problem is, it never really happened. During the Salem Witch Trials, not a single person was burned at the stake. Between 1692 and 1693, more than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft as fear spread through the Puritan community. So where did the idea of burning witches come from? The confusion comes from Europe. During the Great European Witch Hunts, many people accused of witchcraft were burned at the stake. Over time, these images became so famous that they were mistakenly associated with the Salem Witch Trials. Movies, television, and pop culture only reinforced that misunderstanding, and eventually, the myth became accepted as fact. But the historical record tells a different story. The accused witches of Salem were not burned. Instead, they were hanged. A tragic reality that was no less horrific. The Salem Witch Trials remains a sobering reminder of how unchecked fear, suspicion, and hysteria can quickly spiral into injustice and violence. And that's exactly why history is worth revisiting. Sometimes the truth isn't just different from legend, it's completely unexpected. If I asked you what George Washington was famous for besides leading the Continental Army and becoming America's first president, there's a good chance you'd mention his wooden teeth. It's one of the most recognizable stories in all of American history. There's just one problem: they weren't made of wood. Washington struggled with severe dental problems for much of his adult life. By the time he became president, he had lost nearly all of his natural teeth and relied on several different sets of dentures. Those dentures were made from a surprising combination of materials including hippopotamus ivory, walrus ivory, human teeth, cow teeth, and metal springs that helped hold them together. In fact, several of Washington's original dentures have survived and can still be seen today at George Washington's Mount Vernon Museum. So where did the wooden teeth myth come from? As the ivory aged, it became stained from food, drink, and years of use. The surface also developed tiny cracks and grooves, giving it an appearance that could resemble weathered wood. Over time, people began describing Washington's dentures as wooden, and the story spread from generation to generation. The real story was far less comfortable. Some of his teeth were teeth from enslaved people. His dentures often fit poorly, caused him constant pain, and even changed the shape of his face. If you've ever noticed that Washington rarely smiled in his portraits, his dental problems were likely a major reason why. It's another reminder that history is often more complicated and more fascinating than the myths we grew up believing. Our next myth takes place on the night of April 18th, 1775. It's one of the most famous scenes in American history. A man races through the countryside on horseback, shouting, "The British are coming, the British are coming." At least that's how most of us remember it. In reality, there's no evidence that Paul Revere ever yelled those famous words during his ride through Massachusetts. For one, it would have defeated the entire purpose of his mission. Revere wasn't trying to attract attention, he was trying to avoid it. British soldiers were already patrolling the roads, and a loud rider announcing his presence would have likely been stopped before completing his mission of secretly warning colonial leaders and militias that British troops were marching out of Boston. There's another reason the phrase doesn't make much sense. In 1775, many of the colonists still considered themselves British. The dispute wasn't between Americans and the British in the way that we think about it today. It was a conflict between British subjects and their own government. Another common misconception is that Paul Revere made the ride alone. He didn't. Revere was joined by other riders, including William Dawes and later Samuel Prescott. In fact, Prescott was the only one of the three who successfully completed the ride all the way to Concord after Revere was detained by a British patrol officer. So why does Paul Revere get nearly all of the credit? Much of his fame comes from the 1861 poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow titled Paul Revere's Ride. The poem helped turn Revere into a legendary national hero, but like many poems, it favored a great story over strict historical accuracy. The real ride may not have exactly sounded like the legend, but its impact on American history was just as important. Having just celebrated America's 250th 4th of July, it's the perfect time to revisit one of the most famous moments in our nation's history. Every year, Americans celebrate Independence Day with fireworks, parades, backyard cookouts, and patriotic celebrations. But there's one part of the story that millions of Americans get wrong. The United States Declaration of Independence was not signed on July 4th, 1776. July 4th was the day that the Second Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration. It marked a moment the colonies formally declared themselves independent from Great Britain, which is why we celebrate that date every year. Most of the delegates did not sign on July 4th. Instead, the majority of signatures were added on August 2nd, 1776, nearly a month later. A few delegates even signed later after returning to Congress or receiving permission to add their names. So where did the myth come from? Part of the confusion comes from the date itself. July 4th is written prominently at the top of the Declaration, making it easy to assume that's when everyone gathered to sign it. Popular paintings, movies, and classroom illustrations have only reinforced that image, often depicting all of the Founding Fathers standing together as they signed the document on the 4th of July. Another reason for the confusion is that the signing of the Declaration was a process, not a single dramatic event. After July 4th, authenticated copies were sent throughout the colonies so the Declaration could be read aloud to the public. Congress continued refining official copies, while delegates gradually added their signatures over the following weeks and months. America's independence was declared on July 4th, but the famous signing scene most people imagine came later. It's another reminder that some of the most familiar moments in American history aren't exactly the way we remembered them. When most people think about the Emancipation Proclamation, they picture the moment every enslaved person in America was finally set free. It's one of the most common beliefs about the Civil War. The problem is, that's not exactly how it happened. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in states that were in rebellion against the United States shall be then, henceforward, forever free. Notice what's missing? The proclamation did not apply to the loyal border states that still permitted slavery, such as Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. It also did not immediately free enslaved people living in areas of the Confederacy, because the Union could not enforce it there. So if that's true, why is the Emancipation Proclamation considered one of the most important documents in American history? Because it fundamentally changed the purpose of the war. What had begun as a war primarily to preserve the Union also became a war to end slavery. It discouraged European powers from recognizing or supporting the Confederacy, and it opened the door for nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors to serve in the Union military, strengthening the Union's war effort. Slavery itself wasn't legally abolished throughout the entire United States until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in December 1865. So while the Emancipation Proclamation did not instantly free every enslaved person, it changed the course of the Civil War and became a crucial step on the path towards abolition. If you've ever watched a movie about the Civil War, you've probably seen the scene. A wounded soldier is carried into a field hospital. A surgeon grabs a saw, another man holds the patient down, and the operation begins without any pain relief. It's an absolutely horrifying image. The problem is, that usually wasn't how it went. One of the biggest myths about the Civil War is that amputations were routinely performed without anesthesia. In reality, both Union and Confederate surgeons commonly used anesthesia whenever it was available. The two most common anesthetics were ether and chloroform, and medical records show they were used in the overwhelming majority of documented major operations. That doesn't mean surgery was easy and every amputation was done with anesthesia. The anesthesia reduced or eliminated the pain during the procedure, but Civil War medicine still faced enormous challenges. Surgeons had little understanding of germs, antibiotics did not exist, and battlefield hospitals were often crowded and unsanitary. As a result, infection, not the operation itself, was one of the greatest dangers a wounded soldier faced. So why is this myth accepted as fact? Partly because the reality was still so shocking. Thousands of amputations were performed during the war, and the sight of piles of discarded limbs outside field hospitals became one of the conflict's most haunting images. Movies and television also tend to emphasize the brutality of Civil War surgery. The truth is that Civil War medicine was primitive by today's standards, but it wasn't as primitive as many people imagine. Few battles in American history are as famous as the Battle of Gettysburg. For 3 days in July 1863, tens of thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers fought across the hills and fields surrounding the small Pennsylvania town. By the time the fighting ended, it had become the bloodiest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. Because of its importance, many people believe Gettysburg ended the Civil War. The truth is, the war was far from over. Gettysburg was unquestionably a turning point, though. Robert E. Lee's army retreated back into Virginia, ending its second and final invasion of the North. The Confederacy would never again launch a major offensive campaign into Union territory. The Civil War continued for nearly 2 more years. Some of its fiercest campaigns, including the Overland Campaign, the Siege of Petersburg, and William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea, were still to come. Hundreds of thousands more soldiers would become casualties before the conflict finally came to an end. So why do so many people think Gettysburg ended the war? Partly because it's remembered as the battle that shifted the momentum in the Union's favor. Combined with the Union victory at Vicksburg, which concluded just 1 day after, it marked one of the most significant weeks of the entire war. Gettysburg did not end the Civil War, but it helped make a Union victory far more likely. Our final myth brings us to one of the most memorable stories ever told about an American president. You've probably heard it before. President William Howard Taft was so large that he got stuck in the White House bathtub. It's a pretty funny story. The problem is, there's absolutely no evidence that it ever happened. Taft was the heaviest president in American history, weighing well over 300 pounds during his presidency. Because of his size, the White House did order an unusually large bathtub after he took office, one big enough for several people. That part is true, but despite the legend, historians have found no reliable contemporary account showing that Taft actually became stuck in a bathtub while serving as president. So where did the story come from? Like many myths, it seems to have grown over time. Newspaper jokes and political cartoons probably helped transform this myth into fact. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Ironically, the bathtub story has become one of the most famous things about Taft, even though one of his greatest achievements came after he left the White House. In 1921, Taft became Chief Justice of the United States, making him the only person in American history to serve as both President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's pretty legendary, to be honest. And maybe that's the biggest lesson from today's video. History doesn't just preserve facts. Sometimes it preserves great stories, even when those stories aren't true. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you left a like, comment, and subscribe. And if this one does well, I'd love to make a part 2 covering even more of the biggest myths in American history. Until next time, thanks for watching.